that many times I was beginning to wonder if I had enough faith to do this, because things from time to time didn't seem like they were going right, and we didn't feel that this was right or that was right. And we were 5 weeks yesterday on the road and 5,000 miles, and we just got pretty tired, and the children got sleeping in a different bed every night, and they got a little bit uptight, and we'd get a little bit uptight, and then we'd take it out on them, and they'd cry, and we'd tell them to be quiet, and you're at somebody else's house, and it was just some very difficult times. However, the Lord is gracious, and the Lord is good, and He showed us and encouraged us many times through His Word. And I think what I'll do first, I'm going to give you one verse that the Lord gave me about a week before we left to go on this trip. Now, you need not turn there, but I'd like to turn there and read it. It's in Psalm 27. It's just one verse, and I want to take this verse out of context to use the application. In the context in which we find this verse, David is writing concerning the onslaughts of the enemy that he's had to put up with, and that they're trying to get him and all of this. And most of you would know the story of David and how that before he took the throne he was chased about by King Saul and so forth. And this is probably a psalm, one that's sort of almost a prayer against the enemy, that he calls God to help him and so forth. And right tucked away right in the context of this psalm, where David is crying for protection against the enemies and all, he says this: "Teach me thy way, O Lord, and lead me in a plain path because of my enemies." And as I was just meditating on the Word one morning before we left, and I was reading in the Psalms, this verse really stood out to me. And I thought, you know, I am so hard-headed and so short-sighted and so everything that it's just hard for me to get the will of the Lord many times. I said, Lord, that's what I need. Teach me thy way and lead me in a plain path, a plain path. And so this was sort of my theme, I suppose, for the 5 weeks that we were on the road. I was definitely looking for the pathway of the Lord. Now, we left here on May the 14th. Graduation was May the 12th, and then Saturday, May the 14th, we left here, and we traveled down to Blind River. We stayed in the house of Elmer and Rosalind Carlson in Blind River Saturday night. We got to see Werner and Carol and some of the other folks, and we wanted to attend the ministry there on the Lord's Day, but we felt as though we should go on to Elliott Lake. And so that following Sunday, we drove into Elliott Lake that morning and attended the morning service. And we were greeted by Mr. Collins, Charlie Collins, at the door there. And he asked me that morning if I'd minister the Word, and I told him that I had just come to fellowship with them, and that I thought that they should just go ahead and have their regular meeting. And so I didn't minister the Word that morning, and we just sat in, and we had lunch with Mr. Collins after the meeting that morning, and began to discuss the possibilities of Elliott Lake. Now, from all that we could see and find out, Elliott Lake is certainly going to be a boom town, and just, well, it is, and it's going to just increase probably by way of people in a very large degree in the next few years. And there was a response to have some help there and all, and so we talked about it a bit as to what a fellow might want to do if he came in, and what the chapel might want. And so we sort of just left that open without any commitments at all, and we gave him our address where we could be reached in Mississippi, because that's where we were going to be spending the most time. And we knew how to reach them, and so we left Elliott Lake, and we drove from Elliott Lake down to Picton, Ontario, where we stayed a few days with Ann's sister Ruth and her brother-in-law Gene. And we had quite a refreshing time with the family down there. We stayed Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday, and we left there Thursday to Grand Valley. And we traveled just Thursday morning, and we got there the middle of the afternoon. And Grand Valley is a little town of about 1,000 people, about 70 miles west of Toronto. And it's just beautiful land there if you're a farmer. The dirt's black, and the roads are all plowed straight down in that country, and they were just beginning to break ground and begin to planting some things, and the spring was right in full bloom, and it was a very lovely time of year. And we drove up to the house of Gary and Josie Alford, and she met us. He was still out on his truck. He drives a truck. They sell industrial shoes, and so it wasn't but a couple of hours, I suppose, that he came in. And this is a town, and you'll probably remember that I think was mentioned here before we left, that there is not a ministry or fundamental ministry or really any kind of evangelical ministry there. There is I think there's some denominational churches. There's Latter-day Saints, Jehovah's Witness, Church of Christ, and some others there. There's quite a few churches there in a small town like that, but not one that really was grounded and taught the word of the Lord. And so they had in mind that perhaps it might be possible to begin a ministry there. And this is the basis that we went on, the possibility of beginning something. So we fellowshiped with them that night. We did a little bit of looking around after supper that night, and a whole lot of talking. And we come to find out that, we was thinking there were some other couples that were willing to maybe do something. As it turned out to be, these other couples really weren't. And Gary and Josie were really the only ones that were interested in trying to do something. They had been attending a brethren assembly, I suppose about maybe 15 miles away in another town. And they were a little bit anxious for the ministry to be more than what it offered. And as we looked around that night, however, he did show me another little ministry in the area, I suppose maybe about a half-hour's drive, that is doing something. Now, it's certainly, when you pass by the building, I don't know if it's between there and Orangeville on a secondary road, the little building would be about as big as this part of the chapel, I suppose, with a full basement in it. And just a shack of a place. Looks almost like a sharecropper's house. You might think of something like that. But they say that place is just packed out every Sunday morning, and that they are preaching the word there, but I forget the details. For some reason or other, that Alford did not attend there. We contemplated very strongly the idea of beginning a ministry there, and tried to look, and it's so hard to do this, objectively at the approach. Would it be feasible? Would it be possible? Is there enough potential here? And I suppose that we came to the answer, yes, it is. And it's worth pursuing, and it's worth doing. And so the public school was to be the place where we could have a ministry for a while once we began a ministry. And so we stayed that night and the next day. And the next day, we had an unfortunate experience of having to do something that unfortunately is part of the ministry, and that is you got to have a place to stay. And so you can't hardly raise a family on the sidewalk. And so we said, well, this has to be involved in the ministry. And we looked around there, and there's a lovely little place in a town. And we thought, well, Gary knew a realtor, and he said, I'll give him a call, and he'll come over. He wasn't a saved man, but he was very, very sympathetic to the situation that we were in, and very gracious. And we had just a little opportunity to witness to him at the end of that time that he spent with us. And he showed us, of course, a little town of 1,000 people. There's just not that much. We found out that the first thing we were looking for was a place to rent. The only place available in Grand Valley to rent for a family was located on the main street, and the front door opened up on the sidewalk. So I think you know that type of a situation, kind of a boarding house situation. And I don't want to sound toothy or ungrateful or anything like that, but we just didn't feel that we could carry on effective ministry in a place of that kind. Not that we want anything great or big, but it just didn't feel that that would be conducive to the ministry. And so we approached this realtor guy about showing us the possibility of buying a home. And so that only took, I suppose, about an hour and a half to see everything that was available in the town. And to say the least, without going in details, it wasn't anything feasible. It was all out of reach one way or the other. When it needed too much work at a cheap price, or too big of a price that didn't need any work or something. And so, anyhow, we left Grand Valley with the idea, and gave Gary our phone number in Mississippi, and said, Gary, let's pray about this, and if the Lord wants us to begin a ministry here, I'm sure He'll give us a place to stay one way or the other. And so we left that with the idea of the Lord now going on and opening the door. And I hate like fury to put a temporal thing by way of a hinge on the ministry of the Lord. But in this situation, I didn't see any other thing. We were quite willing to step into that situation, and yet we knew we had to have a place to stay and this type of thing. And so we left it in that sense. We went down and spent a couple of days, Saturday and Sunday with Shirley and Elwood Morrison down in Woodstock. Monday morning, we left and went to, headed out for Mississippi. And we got in Mississippi Wednesday. And we stayed in Mississippi for a week visiting with Mom and Dad. And then during this time, we'd never heard anything from Gary. We were still praying about it. We didn't contact him and told him we wouldn't until we got ready to leave from down there. Then from Mississippi, Mom and Dad kept the kids for us, and we went to Birmingham, Alabama for 5 days. Now, most of you have heard me speak often of Howard Borland, the man that led me to the Lord. Well, we got to see Howard and his wife Dixie and spend some time with them. We went back to see quite a few of the friends that we knew in Birmingham, and while we were there, we got to see Shelley McDonald. And a lot of you will remember Shelley graduated with us, and it was such a joy to be able to see Shelley. Shelley's had some hard times since she's left here, and some very difficult times. But the Lord has brought that little girl through these times, and she's working as a unit clerk at the Sick Children's Hospital there in Birmingham. And we went up there that night. She was still on work and on shift. And we went up there, and she said, if you could come up, I can take a 30-minute break. She said, I haven't taken a break all day. And said, come up and we'll go down and have some coffee. And so we went up there, and you know, Shelley's very sympathetic anyhow, and I don't know how in the world she works in a place like that, because you see all these little guys, you know, with broken arms and normalities of one kind or other, sick and crippled and hurt. And she said time and time again they get abuse cases in there with the little guys in there with cigarette burns all over them and beat up, and I can't stand it. I don't know how she stands it. She just seems like she's worse than I ever was about that kind of thing. But she got a smile on her face and the joy of the Lord in her heart. She said to be sure and say hello to all of you folks here. And that she's anticipating perhaps this fall or early winter maybe getting away. She's going to have, I think, a week vacation. Said she'd like to spend it up here. And so you might pray that if that is what the Lord would have, that He'd work that out for her. I don't think there's anything else significant that you folks would appreciate in Birmingham. They tried to hog tie us down there. They wanted us to get into that Wales Goulais ministry some kind of a way. And they do have quite a growing ministry down there, and they really do love the Lord. And those people, I'll tell you, we might not agree everything right down the line in our theology, but you won't find a group of people that are more faithful to the Lord than some of those people that are in that little church down there. That's not a little church, but the nucleus that's really carrying that church on. So we came back from Birmingham back to Sardis, and I ministered at the Tuesday night Bible study group. And I just throw this in passing. This will be 9 years this coming November since the Lord laid it on my heart to try to get something going down there by way of a Bible study. And big or little, hit or miss, they have not missed a Tuesday night in 9 years. And they're still having a ministry, and there's a man that's ministering to them down there now. I don't know how he does it. He's taken off a bigger bite than I'd have courage to, but he just went through the 7 churches and Revelation, and now he's gone to the book of Ezekiel. And he's looking at prophecies concerning the coming of the Lord from Ezekiel. And it's quite a study. I sat in on it the first Tuesday night, and then the second Tuesday night we were there and ministered the word for him. We stayed all together, I think, 3 weeks or almost 3 weeks, including the time in Alabama, down in Mississippi. And when we were getting ready to pack up and to come back, just a few days before, wait a minute. Before that, we went up and saw Hugh Liming. That's where I got his radio. And we walked into a little paint and interior decorating store, and Hugh Liming was in there, and we caught him completely by surprise, and had just a good time. And you know, Hugh, he told the lady, "I'll be back in a few minutes," and we were gone all afternoon, you know, showing around, and went over and saw Sue and the family and all this. Hugh's just like he always was. Hugh and Sue have quite a thing before them, and perhaps some of you know about it, but let me just tell you exactly what we heard from him just a couple of nights before we left. And that was this, that they have put in an application as a family to go down to, it's a place called Pensacola Christian School down in Pensacola, Florida. It's quite a large place. It has a full school, I suppose, right from kindergarten up through 12th grade, and then a college, Bible college there also. And Hugh and Sue and their family have applied to go, the children to go to school, and Hugh and Sue to work, to be on staff at the school. And the last report that we got from them, just before we left, they had been down, they'd looked it over, they'd had the interview, and they were just waiting on a call. And they didn't think that there was anything that was going to hinder them or hold them back. They were just checking out a few references and things like this, I suppose, before they made their final decision down there to call them. He'll be working on the maintenance end, and Sue will be doing some type of secretarial work, I think about 6 hours a day just during the school year, and then nothing during the summer. And so they're excited about that, and they said be sure and pass on the word, a great big hello, and to pray for them that the Lord would show them definitely how He would have them to go. That was when we first saw them, and then before we left, we were back up there for supper, and I, of course, had to go to Memphis in the meantime and pick up my trailer. Bill had pulled the trailer down, and we got to see Sherry and Bill and little Billy, And little Billy looked just like Mr. Armstrong to me. Just a spitting image. He looked just like a little miniature Mr. Armstrong. And he's growing, and I guess Ann said she couldn't remember if he was 10 or 12 pounds now, but he must just be eating up on that southern food down there and growing. They were doing real fine. Pray for Bill and Sherry. They really find themselves in tight down there right now. And last time we talked to him, Bill had just gone to work painting, and painting outside, exterior, with another guy, just job to job type of a thing. It was good money as long as the sun shines, but when it rains, you don't work. And they only had, I think, 10 weeks left to work before they have to be back up here. And my understanding was they needed between $3,000 and $4,000 before they would grant them an entry back in for the year. And that means, I'm not good at math, but he's going to have to save about $350 a week for 10 weeks to bring that money back, and it's going to be hard. And they're just a little bit discouraged, and they're just wondering about whether or not they're going to make it back. So I know you want to pray for them and lift them up in this regard. While we were at Hughes that night, Bill and Sherry brought little Billy down, and Mary Jane, a lot of you will remember Mary Jane, and her husband and her little baby named Amy came down also. And we had just a real good time of fellowship and getting to see Mary Jane again and meet her husband and getting to know him. And we had a Bible study that night, and it was just a real enjoyable time in the Lord. And Mary Jane said to be sure and tell everyone hi for her. I forget where they are. My wife ran off. You'll have to ask her later. They're up northeast of the states there somewhere, New York or Rochester, New York. Okay. All right, now I'm back to Mississippi in the last couple of days, and we called Grand Valley. It had been 3 weeks. We called Grand Valley, and Gary said nothing. Not even a place to rent has come up. And I said, well, I've been doing a lot of thinking about New Liskeard. The Lord just did not give me any peace about Elliott Lake. I didn't pursue Elliott Lake any further than the day that we were there. I never heard anything from Elliott Lake. And during this period of waiting, and this several weeks now of waiting at Grand Valley, my heart was exercised again toward New Liskeard. And I told Ann, I said, you know, I was at New Liskeard in April for the Elders Conference. And when I left there, I knew they expressed a desire for some help. But when I rode back with Jack, I can remember telling Jack just as plainly when we left out of there, Jack said, well, what do you think about New Liskeard? And I said, well, the folks are real fine. And I said, I'm sure it'd be a good place of ministry, but I'm not interested. And I wasn't. And during this 3 weeks of waiting to see what would come up at Grand Valley, I began to start thinking about New Liskeard. And the realization certainly hit me. You know, I never even prayed about it. I really didn't. I didn't consider it. And I didn't look objectively at New Liskeard like I had at Grand Valley. So I picked up the phone, I called Gary. And I said, Gary, what's up? He said, nothing. And I said, well, I wanted you to know that we'll still pray about this, but that I'm going to, when I hang up, I'm going to call New Liskeard, and I'm going to talk to Wes Richards and to see if they're still interested in having a full-time worker. If they are, I said, before we go back to Goulais, I said, I think we're going back to New Liskeard and talk with the folks there. And he, of course, he was disappointed as we were disappointed. And yet at the same time, he assured me that he would be praying for us and that he knew we wanted to be where the Lord wanted us and that it wouldn't work if we wasn't. And so we left within just a few days, and we left on a Thursday. We arrived in New Liskeard on a Saturday. Now, this would be a week ago yesterday that we arrived in New Liskeard. I talked with Wes Richards. wee hours in the morning, Saturday night. Sunday, I met with the elders of the chapel. They confirmed all that Wes had told me by way of what they would like to see, how they would be very pleased to have a worker to move into the area and to help out with the ministry. And since there was no opposition there, I told him, I said, well, let's do what the next step was in Grand Valley. Let's see what the possibility of housing is. And so Monday morning, or Sunday night really, we got out the newspaper and looked to see about a place for rent. There were about 3 places that we could find out through the paper and through the realtor on Monday morning that were for rent, and yet there were only 2 bedrooms, and it was small. Each one of the things, it was apartment. There was not any houses available. These were apartments, and we were willing to move into a place that was small temporarily like that. However, I told them, I said, about 3/4 of our ministry is really carried on many times in our home, and I said this is probably 100% of my wife's ministry, is being able to entertain in the home and to have a place where we can have people over. And I said, let's just see if the Lord would give us a place that would be adequate for this type of ministry, of which they all agreed and said that it wasn't that they thought we ought to get this and we didn't. It was an agreement on both of us. Besides that, the rent was ranging from $250 to $300 a month. Now that's pretty high rent in a small place. And so we toyed with the idea of looking around, see what would be available to buy. Now, we're in no situation to buy anything, but anyhow, the Lord has been very gracious to us in days past, and I said, we don't know what the Lord might do. And so we pursued this, and we spent one day, Monday. We looked at houses all day Monday. Tuesday, we bought a house. Wednesday, we started painting. Painted Wednesday and Thursday, and Friday morning I finished up, and we got here Friday night. Now the house is up there. It's a 3-bedroom. It has a full basement. There's a kitchen, a dining room, and a living room. It's 1.5 miles from the chapel, and it's got a nice lot and a place where the kids can play out in the back. And it's just of the Lord, the way the whole thing happened. And we're grateful to Him, and I suppose the only thing that's lacking now is for us to pack our stuff up, to move into the house and begin to minister. Now, you might say, well, what are you going to do when you get up there? Well, the doors of ministry in New Liskeard are at least as great by way of opportunity as they are here. At least, perhaps more. There's really no competition up there at all by way of a good, sound ministry. Now, in another town several miles away, there are some ministries that are going on for the Lord. But if you could visualize, perhaps on a map, a road, and we'll call this Highway 11. It runs out of North Bay. It goes straight up like this. Then the business section of that road detours like this and meets that road again several miles. In this detour is the Tri-City, or the Tri-Cities. First, Cobalt, which is a town of about 1,800. Haleberry, town of 4,400 or better. And then New Liskeard, 5,500. It's hard to tell when you run out of one town into the other. Now, it's not downtown like Sault Ste. Marie. It's scattered through there, but houses all along that main road. The house that we were able to get is right on this bypass, just as you get to the city limits at New Liskeard. It's right on the main road. And altogether, there are 12,000 people there. And as far as we know at this point, the Gospel Chapel, I believe is what it's called there in New Liskeard, is the only fundamental, maybe not evangelical. The Baptist Church has just gone charismatic in New Liskeard. There are a lot of people in that Baptist church that are right here, right now. There is a tremendous opportunity for a good Bible-centered ministry now to help some of these people that are not going along with this charismatic approach. There's a little Baptist church in Haileybury. I don't know much about it. I don't think there's anything in Cobalt. And you're only talking about 15 minutes from one end of that place to the other. And so there's the scope of 12,000 people. You have the small town by way of its layout, and yet it's quite, it has shopping malls, and for you ladies, it's got the Dominion and Kmart and all of this stuff, and it really is just tucked away right in the bush. Lake Temiskaming is on the right, as you would look on the map. On the other side of that lake's Quebec. That's how close we are. And about almost 50% of the people up there speak French. Now, I don't know what I'm doing up there. But I know one thing that we've already begun to pray about, and that is in the future sometime a French ministry there, because it would warrant one. Now, just across the lake there is a camp that is French, and a very godly man, and I couldn't begin to say his name, but Richards know him quite well, and he's carrying on a camp ministry, a television program, radio, and I don't know what all. And I suppose that we'll be affiliated with him in some kind of way there, working with them. They're closely work together with the chapel there at New Liskeard. There's a Bible study going on now, and as soon as I got up there, the guy said, "We've been waiting on you. We want you to take this over." They want us to fit into the ministry on the Lord's Day, at least for a while, probably in a quite a way as far as the ministry there. Someone gonna say, "Well, what do they call you? They call you preacher or pastor?" Or somebody said they call you reverend. I said, "Well, no, they don't call me father." When we were introduced to the people Wednesday night at the prayer meeting, and I took the ministry there, and Mr. Richards, one of the elders there, introduced me as a pastor teacher, and I was grateful for that. I believe that is one area that the Lord's going to give us by way of a ministry there, and one area that they've all confided in me that they need. I suppose probably visitation will be one of the greatest ministries that I would have, let's say, during the week. Nobody's doing any visiting up there to speak of anything, and the doors are wide open. They've already approached us about the public school will give you a room in the fall of the year if you'd like to teach anything, and if you're qualified by way of teaching, then they'll give you a room and you can teach some courses, and they'd like, or at least are toying with the idea of perhaps teaching a couple of night courses through the school year at the public school. And there's several that would be interested in doing this. And so I suppose there's much more, but I've made it as brief as I could, and I see I've taken up all the time. That's really where we are right now. And someone asked me, how do you know this is the will of the Lord for you? That's a hard thing to answer. But I'll tell you from experience what answer I gave that man. I said, sometimes the conviction of being out of the will of the Lord is greater than the peace of being in the will of the Lord. And I said, I'm not convicted at all about being here. And I hope you can understand that. I know that God has given us some peace. I know when I made the decision, even before I called West in Mississippi, I already felt a little more comfortable about it. And then as we talked, and then as it was confirmed, and then as the Lord just moved, I mean, you just don't move that fast, really. It's almost an impossible situation to go in and be established that quick. And yet it fell into place just like pieces of a puzzle. Take your Bibles and let me share with you something from Hebrews chapter 12, just briefly. I won't keep you long. But I suppose one passage of Scripture that has been an encouragement to me that I'd like to make by way of application for you tonight will perhaps encourage you. Hebrews chapter 12, I'd like to read the first 3 verses. When I've preached an entire message on this in days past, I've entitled this The Race. And that's what I feel like I've been running for the last 5 weeks, is a race. And yet, it's more than a race in one sense. It is the chase, really, of the pursuit of God's will for one's life. Let me read verses 1 to 3 in Hebrews chapter 12. The apostle says, "Wherefore, seeing we also are compassed about with so great a cloud of witnesses, let us lay aside every weight and the sin which does so easily beset us, and let us run with patience the race that is set before us, looking unto Jesus, the author and finisher of our faith, who for the joy that was set before him endured the cross, despising the shame, and is set down at the right hand of the throne of God. For consider him that endured such contradiction of sinners against himself, lest ye be wearied and faint in your minds." For those of you that are practicing your alliteration, I have a very poor one that I'll share with you tonight. In verse 1, the first part, we have the witness of this race, the witness. And then in the second part of that verse, we have the way of the race. In verse 2, we have the watch, looking unto Jesus, the watch of this race. And then in verse 3, we have the warning of this race. And just very briefly, could I try to make an application for you as well as for me? The apostle comes along, and the first statement that he makes is he mentions a witness. A witness. He says, "Wherefore, seeing we also are compassed about with so great a cloud of witnesses." Now, there's been much said about this, and some say, well, he's talking about all of the great heroes of the faith mentioned in Hebrews chapter 11, and I think probably that is right. He makes a list here of Abel, Enoch, Noah, Abraham, Sarah, Isaac, Jacob, Joseph, Moses, and Rahab, and on the list goes. And how these men and women of faith hurdled the obstacles. They ran the race. They made it for the Lord. And then he comes along and he says, well, you're compassed about with so great a cloud of witnesses. But stop just for a moment and think about the witness of this race. A witness. What is a witness? A witness is one who declares or tells what he has seen or heard or done. If you go to court and you have a trial of some kind, they call a witness. They may say an eyewitness, and this witness would tell what had happened. These witnesses that we are compassed about are witnesses, perhaps these folks here, but have you ever thought about the witnesses that they were encompassed with were not these folks here per se, because they wasn't living at the time he wrote. Perhaps they were living in the letter. The scriptures came alive and they could know them, but there must have been other witnesses that was around them also that would aid in encouraging these people to run this race. But one thing that I think all of them did by way of a witness was this. they witnessed, number one, to the faithfulness of God. To the faithfulness of God. For instance, now Abel was killed and Enoch was translated, so we don't have much about them. But you start in verse 7 of chapter 11 with Noah, and you work your way through. These great men and women of faith who we often think were spiritual giants in their day, and they were. But they were just people. They were just people. And they and their lives witnessed to the faithfulness of God. You know how I know that? Because God was faithful in calling Noah. He was. Noah found grace in the eyes of the Lord. Abraham also testified of the faithfulness of God when he by faith did what God said. God, through his faithfulness, did all that he promised he would for Abraham. Not only do they witness of the faithfulness, but they also witness of the security that is in the Lord. You know how I know that? Noah doesn't have a very good report for the last 350 years of his life, but God doesn't mention that in the Hall of Fame. God doesn't mention in the Hall of Fame in Hebrews chapter 11 that Abraham tried to pass Sarah off as his half-sister, and he was going to let her go and stay with Pharaoh in his house. It doesn't record about Sarah and how she laughed and how she denied and how that she didn't believe the Lord. It doesn't talk about all of the problems and trials that these people had because they were secure in Jesus Christ. First, God is faithful, and he does not remember all of the sin, all of the unfaithfulness of them, but when he records it for us, he records that which is good. And so this witness then that we're compassed about ought to do two things. Ought to remind us, number one, of the faithfulness of God, and number two, the security that is in God. And he goes on from that point of talking about the witness to showing us the way that we ought to run this race. And notice what he says. Let us lay aside every weight and sin which does easily beset us, and let us run with patience the race that is set before us. Now, without going in great detail, let me just land on one thing. The sin which does easily beset us. What was that sin for the nation of Israel? Unbelief. It may take on many manifestations, but it was unbelief. Unbelief. How many times in the wilderness did they say, "Oh, Moses, you brought us out here for us to die in the wilderness. We'd rather be back in Egypt. We'd rather be back there. At least we had something to eat. At least we had water," and on and on and on. Unbelief. Unbelief. Lay aside the weight. Lay aside the sin that easily besets you, and run with patience the race that is set before you. I want to make a little different application of this verse just for a moment. You thought, well, that's good enough, but I really didn't know Noah. I can read about him. I really didn't know Abraham, but I can read about him. And I know that's good, but have you ever thought about this? How about people that you know? Now, I'm not going for a minute to compare myself with Noah or Abraham or any of these other great men of faith. But I will compare myself with them in one way. They had failures like I do. But the one thing that stands out is that God is faithful, not the man. And God is the one to whom the witnesses give the glory and the honor. God is the one who deserves the praise and appreciation, not the man. We don't worship Noah. Noah was a great man. Why? Because God was a greater God. Do you see that? God was a greater God. His faithfulness was greater than Noah's unfaithfulness. And any person that goes on for the Lord is not because they are anything of themselves, but because God's grace is sufficient, and God's grace is greater. There are many people in this ministry right now that are going on for the Lord. Why? because God is greater. God is greater. And tonight, I want to encourage you. You might look at me and you might say, well, Joe's been to Bible school, he's been teaching, he's been preaching, he can do it, I could never do that. He's going on now to some other place of service for the Lord. That's not the case. You have as much potential as I do. God's grace is greater. And it's whether or not a person wants to go on. Listen, I can't do it. I cannot do it. But one thing that I wish that our testimony would leave with this chapel is that you could be next.